Thank you, Dale. Well, thank you, Dale. Am I on? All right, great.
You'll still need to use this.
Oh, okay, thank you. All right. I guess we've got two different things going on. We've got sound through the speakers and a recording. Well, good to be with you. And Dale, thank you. It's a pleasure. It is so good to be back in South Dakota. South Dakota is kind of like a comfortable old favorite pair of jeans. It just feels good to get back in them. It's good to be back here. I remember years ago when I was early in my working life, I was working back on the East Coast, working in D.C., and I was driving home for Christmas, and I drove all the way across the country, got just past Chamberlain, got across the Missouri River, and a big snowstorm hit, and the wet snow wasn't working so well with my car, and it chugged and finally stopped just a little outside one of the little towns on the interstate there. And a patrolman came along. It was a Sunday afternoon, took me into this town, said, I don't know, there might be one shop that might have somebody there. And sure enough, there were a couple guys there, so they went out with their truck, towed me in quite a ways to their shop, worked on it for a long time, and finally got it running, so I was happy about that, but I was nervous about how much this was going to cost, because I just spent, months back on the East Coast where everything, they'll get you for everything as much as they possibly can. So I finally asked the guys a little bit nervously, as a young guy who wasn't being paid very much, so how much is this going to cost? And one guy looked at the other and said, give him $10. It was his truck. Yeah. I gave them both $10, and thank God I was back in South Dakota. But there really is something special about the people. So good to see so many of you. Laura Rupp, who is my administrative assistant. Jeff, her husband, who I sat in the studio with so many times. I could go on with so many of you, and I'll stop because I'll leave somebody out. But it's great to be back here with you now because, most of all, because there are so many important things going on in our country that need to be addressed and that we need to take action on. So many of you are, and I thank you for that. Many of you serving in various ways. So glad to see a number of legislators here. Thank you for your service. Steve and Les I'd worked with before you were in the legislature. So glad you're there. And others. Over the last 15 years, since I left Sioux Falls, I've had an interesting vantage point on the public policy culture wars here in America. I've had the opportunity to work hand in glove with the people that I would consider to be the heroes of the pro-family movement in America. And I'm talking about the leaders and the behind-the-scenes supporters of our nearly 40 state family policy councils, and that includes so many of you. And of course, the one here in South Dakota that we are proud to be associated with is Family Heritage Alliance. Dale, you energize me every time I'm with you. I can't match your energy, but I love it, and I just appreciate your leadership here in South Dakota, doing a great job. I acknowledge these people as heroes of our movement, in part because of the fact that the vast majority of the gains that we have made in this country have been at the state level. And I'll have more to say about that in just a little bit. But they are also heroes because of their stand against the rampaging agenda of the left that's coming from both coasts and is certainly here in many respects as well. This talk was billed as threats and opportunities and reasons for hope. I don't really think I have to sell you on the threats. I think after 7 years of what we've been through as a nation, especially the last year or two, we realize the threats. They're very evident. But I do think it's important to take stock of where we're at and to look at some of the threats, some that are already here, some that are coming to South Dakota. In cataloging those threats, I can't avoid mentioning a couple of things that might not typically be considered family policy issues. First, the $18 trillion national debt we have, and much more if you look at the unfunded entitlement debts. That most certainly is a family issue. that will cause serious harm without a definitive change in course. And second, threats to our national security with the rise of ISIS, the risk of a nuclear Iran, and so many more. But I really want to focus our attention on the cultural threats, the sort that historian Will Durant cited when he concluded that every great civilization has ultimately fallen from within. One of those threats is the attack on marriage that Dale mentioned. It's a battle that's been underway for 2 decades. 19 years ago, here in South Dakota, thanks to the foresight of State Representative Roger Hunt and a coalition effort, South Dakota became the first state to respond to the building threat at that time and to specifically define marriage as the union of a man and a woman. Now, back then, the struggle was to convince legislators that it really was a threat, because the homosexual lobby at that time was, for the most part, saying, we don't want any part of homosexual marriage, of same-sex marriage. That's not what we're striving for. Of course, that certainly was not what they were after, and we would do well to remember that as we face other threats that they sometimes deny. Some would say after the Supreme Court's 5-4 decision that the threat we've moved beyond the threat. We've simply lost. Certainly that's true in the sense that same-sex marriage is now the law in 50 states. But the battle for marriage isn't over any more than the battle over life was over when Roe v. Wade happened. And we've got to remember that. We must stay engaged in the fight for marriage. That's because marriage as the union of a man and a woman is self-evident truth. It's proclaimed not only in Scripture, but also in natural revelation. It's evident in biology. It's evident in social science research. It's evident really in the hearts and minds of most people. So we must work to rebuild a culture of marriage and eventually roll back the Supreme Court's ruling. But there are also current building threats on the issue of marriage. In fact, the campaign for same-sex marriage was never really about marriage itself. Evidence for that is the small number of same-sex marriages around the country. It was more about rolling back standards of morality. And that push continues. Polygamy and polyamory are the next battles. Already court cases are underway dealing with polygamy, and that's the very same way that the same-sex marriage battle began 2 decades ago with a court case in Hawaii that spawned all of this. Further deterioration on the definition and makeup of marriage in our society, which would certainly happen if we would eventually get polygamy or polyamory, that further deterioration would really make marriage basically meaningless, which would have tragic consequences for kids. And after all, as a public policy, kids are what marriage is all about. There are greater reasons for it found in Scripture, but ultimately from a social science standpoint, marriage is about protecting the kids. Closely related to marriage is the very real and growing threat to religious freedom, as we see in today's news about the clerk in Kentucky. While issues related to sexuality are not the only threat to religious freedom, they are clearly the tip of the arrow. The tip of the spear, however you want to say it. What a dramatic change we've had in this country. Just think back to 1993. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act was passed in Congress with just one dissenting vote. It passed the U.S. House unanimously. It passed the U.S. Senate with just one vote against it. And yet, earlier this year, when basically the same language was put forward in Indiana, the media made it out to be the most controversial issue in America. What an astounding change in just 20 years. As you probably know, marriage service providers are under incredible attack around the country. You know about the baker in Oregon who was fined $135,000 for declining to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. You know about the florist in Washington State who is faced with the very real threat of losing her home and her business for declining to provide flowers for a same-sex wedding. And ironically, for a client whom she has served for years knowing that he was gay. She was glad to serve him. She considered him a friend. But when it came to the point of helping him celebrate something that so violated her conscience, she came around the counter, gave him a hug, and said, you know, I just can't do that. But yet she's being targeted by the state's attorney general and could well lose her home, could well lose her business for this. I could give similar examples, maybe not quite as dramatic, but developing examples in a number of other states, including right next door in Iowa and Minnesota. Most of these attacks are happening in localities or in states that have what are called sexual orientation and gender identity ordinances. These are ordinances that add to human rights codes, giving special protections on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, or SOGI, or SOGI. These SOGI ordinances have so far been held off in South Dakota, except for public employment in a few localities. But they've been held off so far in the way that would create these problems, in part thanks to the work of Family Heritage Alliance. We need to continue to hold those off because of what's at stake behind them, because of the religious freedom issues. Other threats are on their way as well. Dale talked about the transgender issue that's currently alive in the state athletic realm, and we appreciate the efforts to oppose that. The U.S. Solicitor General admitted in the oral arguments in the marriage case that Christian colleges and other nonprofits are now in danger of losing funding because of their stance on marriage. Tax exemption could be eventually in danger as well, especially early on at the state level in more liberal states. Another topic of discussion on this front is licensure. Just think of all of the professions that require some form of licensing, from lawyers to plumbers. And you begin to get a picture of how the heavy hand of the state could reach into the private lives of people and compel action and even ideology. Another important battle for South Dakota is likely to be the battle over the legality of professional counseling for those who have unwanted homosexuality. Already 4 states, California, Oregon, Illinois, and New Jersey, yes, that governor signed this, have outlawed such counseling for minors. The same counseling that has helped thousands of young people align their sexuality with their faith and beliefs. Essentially what they have done, at least when it comes to professional counseling for minors, is turn the road of sexuality into a one-way street toward homosexuality. In other words, if you want counseling that affirms homosexuality, fine. But if you're a minor who perhaps has been abused and is struggling with unwanted same-sex attractions, as is fairly common, such professional counseling is illegal in those 4 states. And the push is on all around the country. We've been able to defeat those in a whole host of states. In fact, the only losses we've had in the last couple of years have been in states that, a couple of those states up there that don't have family policy councils. So we appreciate Dale and the team being here to help hold the ground on that front. There are many other threats, including especially the out-of-control courts that have brought many of these battles upon us. Something must be done, and there are early efforts in early stages to begin improving our courts and holding judges accountable. But what about the opportunities? There are actually many, and in some ways they're a key part of the reasons for hope that I'll share with you in a moment. For one, we have a tremendous opportunity to protect life. Pro-abortion groups and their allies in the media have been complaining a lot lately about the literally hundreds of bills that have been passed in state legislatures around the country to protect life. hundreds in just the last few years. These laws have been shown in studies to have substantially reduced the number of abortions performed in those states. Of course, combined with the many other important educational efforts, with the reality of ultrasounds in crisis pregnancy centers and so on. But the laws themselves have been shown to have, I believe it's a 35% reduction rate in the number of abortions in those states on average around the country. Much more, though, remains to be done. Thankfully, the opportunity is better than ever, or better than it's been in a long time. Most of you have probably seen, as was talked about earlier, the ongoing Planned Parenthood videos. They've opened the eyes of millions of people to what's really happening behind those closed doors of the abortion clinics. They've made more real what is happening, not only the taking of the life, but the selling of those bodies. Polls show that Americans are increasingly pro-life, and what's most encouraging about that is the young people are much more likely to be pro-life than older generations, much more likely to be pro-life than recent generations of young people. That's very encouraging for the future. And we need to, right now, be moving the ball down the field on the issue of life because the opportunity is there. Another issue of opportunity that I'll mention briefly is the issue of parental choice in education. Nearly 30 states now have passed some form of parental choice in education, have some kind of school choice program. They give parents a much higher degree of, depending on the level of program, a higher degree of choice in their kids' education. And that number is growing every year. There were several more passed just this year. And it's high time. I know there are efforts underway. It's high time to see that expand in South Dakota. There are other opportunities as well. In the interest of time, I'm not going to share those, but I do want to share a few reasons for hope that I've promised. The first is providence. The most fundamental reason for hope at this time in America is one that as believers we must constantly remind ourselves of, and that is that God is still on the throne. He's not surprised. The world is not spinning out of His control. That really should free us up to be bold, loving, even joyful witnesses for truth and righteousness. Number two, the pendulum swings. With President Obama and his liberal policies getting the headlines for nearly 7 long years, it's easy to think that things will just continue on a downward spiral. But politically speaking, the biggest turnarounds often come, I would say usually come, on the heels of the darkest nights. The 2014 elections were likely an early indicator of just that. As Winston Churchill said in his famous Never Give In speech, quote, "You cannot tell from appearances how things will go." How right those words, spoken in the early days of World War II, turned out to be. Number three, third reason for hope is the simple word overreach. Our opponents on religious freedom particularly are emboldened right now, but that will likely lead them to overplay their hand. Maybe the judge in Kentucky is a good example of that, ordering that clerk to jail. And overreaching in ways that the people of South Dakota and the people of America just won't be ready for. And the fourth reason for hope is the public. Now, while the cultural elites, including many in the media, academia, and big business, are openly hostile to our worldview, polls, including one that CitizenLink did in South Dakota specifically earlier this year, show that the people of this state, and really throughout most of America, tend to be with us on key issues, including the key issue of religious freedom right now. I mentioned at the beginning that the heroes of the pro-family movement are the leaders of the state-allied groups that we work with. There are 38 strong right now, as you see up there on the map, and one in each of those states. And we're certainly proud, as I mentioned earlier, to be associated in South Dakota with Family Heritage Alliance. Dale Barcher and his team are doing a splendid job. They organize the pro-family movement, building up the team around the state. I'm so excited to see what's happening here in Sioux Falls. And next month, you've got a tremendous event happening, and I hope you'll all be at that and invite others to come as well. It's important to build up the army around the state, an army of activists that can get engaged and make a difference on all of these issues. They work at the Capitol, equipping legislators, equipping our friends, some of whom are here, with information, mobilizing people to support the right values, and holding legislators' feet to the fire with some accountability, as you're doing with the scorecard. That's very important as well. So I urge you to get involved. If you aren't already in the work of Family Heritage Alliance. For CitizenLink, for our part, we equip these groups. Most of them we've actually started around the country. And then we connect and equip them in all kinds of different ways. We connect them with our allies at the Family Research Council, helping on national issues. We connect them with our allies at Alliance Defending Freedom, the leading defenders, a whole host of attorneys who are leading defenders of religious freedom around the country. We connect them with our allies and close partners there at Focus on the Family. And then we equip them directly, CitizenLink does, with all kinds of public policy resources, with shared services that help them not have to reinvent the wheel as they run their organizations. They can use similar things as other groups around the country. But maybe most of all, for us, Family Heritage Alliance is our eyes and ears on what's happening in South Dakota. So when they call and express a need, we jump to action. And I encourage you to do the same. Support their work financially. Pray for them. And get involved in that citizen army that is so important to making a difference. A moment ago, I quoted Winston Churchill's "Never Give In" speech. But there's another paragraph in that speech that is my favorite. He lightly, as he was giving that speech, he lightly chided the organizers of the event he was speaking at, again, early in World War II. He lightly chided them for referring to those days as dark days. He recognized the peril, but as a historian, he also saw the incredible opportunity the people of Britain had to make a difference in the course of history. And this is his quote: "Do not let us speak of darker days. Let us speak rather of sterner days. These are not dark days. These are great days. The greatest days our country has ever lived. And we must all thank God that we have been allowed, each of us according to our stations, to play a part in making these days memorable." What a great day to be an American. We don't live in a humdrum time in America. We live in a great moment to be alive, to make a difference as an American and as a Christian. So let's go make the most of it. Thank you so much for allowing me to come and share.